welcome back. And to all of the newcomers, welcome to this evening's session. How many of you were not here during the day? A few. Well, anyhow, the only regret you'll have after tonight's session is that you weren't here this morning and for those wonderful 2 rounds of breakout sessions. But it's been a great day, and we're delighted you're here tonight, all of you. Again, on behalf of the West Michigan Academic Consortium and the Kaufman Interfaith Institute, we want to thank Cornerstone, Dr. Stowell, who could not be here, Dr. Rick Ostrander, Provost, who you'll hear from in a minute, and Professor John Duff, our consortium committee member from Cornerstone, for hosting today's conference. Thank you very much. We have several distinguished guests whom I'd like to recognize. The president of Kuyper College, President Nick Croce. Dr. Rick Ostrander, Provost of Cornerstone. Dr. Gail Davis, Provost of Grand Valley. Cheryl Branson, no, she could not make it. And Hope College, Dr. Richard Ray. Just a couple quick announcements. Please fill out your evaluation forms before you leave and leave it at the registration desk. We value your input and we take it very seriously in planning future events. Would like to announce that the Year of Interfaith Service under the great leadership of Doug Kinchy, Director of the Kaufman Institute, and Kay Gordon, Program Manager of the Kaufman Institute, is now underway. It started, and it will conclude, well, it goes on and on and on, but one of the climatic events will be the October 29th, 2015 Triennial Dialogue with Rabbi Daniel Hartman, Cynthia Campbell, the former president of McCormick Theological Seminary, and Omid Safi, who is now heading the Islamic Center at Duke University. And I think that is it, so mark your calendars for October 29th, 2015. And now I invite Rick Ostrander to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Sylvia, and welcome to our campus. We're in the middle of fall break, so it's great to have some people on campus today to liven up the campus a bit. And thanks for your patience with the construction project going on here. If we had waited 1 year and held this conference next year, you would see a beautiful new chapel outside our building, but we are eagerly looking forward to the completion of that by next summer. So I also want to thank you, Dr. Duff, our institutional representative with the West Michigan Academic Consortium, for his work on this body, and also for the staff here at Cornerstone who prepared the food and just made sure that everything was ready to go today. So I appreciate their help and their work on this. And also, I should also mention Dr. Michael Stevens, a colleague, is here. And there's some information on the table outside concerning an interfaith event that the Grand Rapids Symphony Orchestra will be conducting next month, and Michael has some information for you about that. But my main purpose is to introduce our speaker for tonight. Dr. William Schweiker is Director of the Martin Marty Center for the Advanced Study of Religion at the University of Chicago Divinity School. As you can tell by reading the program, Dr. Schweiker is a very prolific scholar. A number of his books are listed there in the program. The most recent one is Dust That Breathes, Christian Faith and the New Humanism. At dinner last night with Dr. Schweiker, while we were receiving our salads, he was asked the question, so what projects are you working on? And so by the time he was done explaining that, we were all ready for the main course and he had not begun his salad yet. That gives you some idea of the extent of projects that he's involved in right now. He travels widely speaking on questions of ethics and theology. His two talks today are on the question, does religion have a future? Which, as a provost of a Christian college, I definitely hope that the answer is yes. Tonight, his talk is entitled, Which Religion and What Future? So please welcome Dr. Schweiker.
Thank you, Rick, for that lovely introduction, and all of you for coming out this evening. We have a lot to cover. I made a lot of promises this morning that I hope to fulfill, because we're trying to think about the religious life and our responsibilities for the future, which is the topic for tonight. And so I would like to plunge right in. I'm going to recap a little bit of what I did this morning. I hope this isn't too much for those of you who were here, although I hear it was a good lecture. Sylvia said it. I hope she didn't mean this was going to be a bad lecture. So recall in my first lecture, I tried to map some of the terrain that we have to cover in order to think ethically about religion in the future. We noted various responses to the question of whether or not religion has a future. I explored different types of religions and their vulnerabilities to certain violent expressions of themselves. We isolated, or I tried to isolate, the crux of the matter in terms of the relationship between religious identity and moral responsibility. More on that as we proceed as well. Finally, I noted the strange entanglement between utterly understandable contemporary forms of what I called practical atheism and violent religion, the odd way in which these are feeding off of each other. The very fact that we find that to be the case on the global scene shows us how we are living in a post-secular age. We now turn from interpretation and analysis of our situation to the question of a possible response. As I was saying over dinner, one of the most difficult questions to answer in moral and political and religious thinking is simply, what is going on? And that's what I tried to provide an account of in the morning lecture. But now we have to ask, how are we going to respond to that? We have to ask, which religion and what future? And this turns once again on the relationship between identity and moral responsibility. Let us begin then with interpreting religious and ethical sources. So the first section here is interpreting religious and ethical sources. I want to start by citing again and at some length the op-ed piece in the New York Times I cited this morning by the scholar Reza Aslan, because it sets up the issues I want to get at, even though I'm offering a very different argument than the one he offers. In that op-ed, he wrote the following, quote, "The abiding nature of Scripture rests not so much in its truth claims as it does in its malleability, its ability to be molded and shaped into whatever form a worshiper requires. The same Bible that commands Jews to love your neighbor as yourself, Leviticus 19:18, also exhorts them to, quote, kill every man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey, who worship any other god. 1 Samuel 15:13. He goes on, the same Jesus Christ, who told his disciples to turn the other cheek, Matthew 5:39, also told them that he had come not to bring peace, but the sword, Matthew 10:34, and that he who does not have a sword shall sell his cloak and buy one, unquote, Luke 22:6. The same Quran that warns believers, quote, if you kill one person, it is as though you have killed all humanity, 5:32, also commands them, quote, slay the idolater wherever you find them. Surely Aslan is right, and I was illustrating this morning. He is right to note that the world's religions have extremely ambiguous sacred scriptures, at least ethically speaking. And that while some religious people would deny it, those same texts are not self-interpreting, because they must be interpreted in order to understand out and in order to live out their teachings They are vulnerable to all manner of interpretation, violent or peaceful. And surely it is also right that for some people the texts are taken to mean whatever form a worshiper requires. Now that may be true descriptively and sociologically, but we're doing ethics in these lectures, and so we have to ask a different kind of question. What form should and ought the worshiper require? That is, if we are to make responsibility the ground of our choices about religious identity, then we need some ethical principle or value to determine the possible responsible interpretations of religious sources. Now there is one strategy that religious thinkers throughout the ages and in various traditions have taken. It is sometimes called, at least within Christian thought, it's called the canon in the canon. That is, it means that a specific norm or value found within the sacred texts and teaching are used as the norm for interpreting all of Scripture. That is why I noted the saying from Hillel this morning, for those who are around, and also quoted 1 John. Give a few other examples. In Christianity, for instance, St. Augustine, in his De Doctrina Christiana, argues that once you understand that the love of God is the meaning of the Bible, then you don't even need Scripture anymore. You throw it away. You've got the point. Martin Luther thought that the book of James was straw and could be and should be removed from the canon because it did not proclaim Christ rightly. And similar ideas are found in other traditions. The point is that texts and rituals have to be interpreted, and so ethically speaking, there needs to be some valid norm or value to interpret them responsibly. So in thinking about this norm or value for the interpreting of our religious traditions, we're asking again about the relationship between identity, religious identities, and responsibilities. And if we make identity the norm of interpretation, that is, if we say that my Christian, or your Buddhist, or her Jewish, or his Islamic identity trumps everything else, then we're back to the vulnerabilities within the missionary and non-missionary religions we explored this morning. What is more, insofar as we live in post-secular societies, then we cannot expect every one of our fellow citizens to have the same religion, or any religion at all. And so if we are to live within diverse and pluralistic societies in a world marked by global interactions, then we need a way to interpret religious resources in ways that are at least understandable to people who do not share our religious or racial or ethnic identities. Parenthetically, I think with the spread of global media markets, we're living in the largest migrations of peoples in history. And we also know that disease has now gone global. Think about what's going on in Dallas. You can run, but you can't hide from the global age. Right? So we simply have to think about these matters as we're living with very different people in very different contexts. Now it is here, it seems to me, that human rights has been so important on the world scene and functions something like an ethical lingua franca on the world scene. Yet it is also the case, as many of you noted, that human rights discourse can neglect our responsibility for other forms of life. That is the ecology of our planet and non-human animals. I judge then that we actually need, granting the power of human rights discourse on the global scene, I actually think we need a broader conception of the norms for the responsible interpretation of religious sources. Now, importantly, in this slide, it's crucial to note that phrases like reverence for life, sanctity of life, dignity of life, respect for life, are ubiquitous in social, political, and religious discourse around the world. They are found in church statements, political slogans, as well as international documents like the Earth Charter. There are also movements that are called the greening of religions, that is, to interpret them in environmentally responsible ways. So in the face of religious violence, of environmental endangerments, of genocide, disease, and on, we've got a lot of problems to face. After all, human actions and relations arise out of and are rooted in life itself, in our desires, our vitalities, our needs. Human freedom is entangled with these vitalities and needs as we strive for some measure of wholeness in our lives, some integrity within our communities. The primal moral question is, how should we live? And that question, I'm suggesting, flows from existence itself and reaches out to some conception of the good life. Ethics, as I noted this morning, is the critical examination and orientation of life, realizing that life is the origin and the aim of moral striving. Of course, life struggles with life. Life is a robber. We all have consumed wonderful meals. Somebody gave up their life for that wonderful meal. And we will also replenish the earth in our own ways. So an ethics then has to provide a realistic means to limit conflicts and focus on goods and achievements if personal and social and non-human life is to endure. Group loyalties, the clash of raw drives must, in some realistic way, be transformed and ordered for the sake of the future. And this means, again, that we have to get straight the proper relationship between responsibility and identity so that identity doesn't become a destiny of conflict. Now, in reaching that tentative conclusion, that is, and it's not only myself, others have done it, made arguments that the category of life itself has to become ethically central rather than some other concepts, such as virtue or such as the highest good. On reaching that tentative conclusion about making the integrity of life basic for contemporary ethics, we see in the terms of the title of this lecture what future we should strive to realize. The future we ought to strive for individually and globally is one that respects and enhances the integrity of life, rather than plunging us ever deeper into violent conflict, environmental degradation, and the disregard of our responsibility for future generations. And yet that conclusion, or temporary conclusion, actually runs aground some deeply seated ideas both in the religions and within the strands of Western moral thought. So I need to briefly clarify this point about the integrity of life and what it means for interpreting religious sources in a responsible way. That is, the focus on the integrity of life, an idea that I'm going to explore in a few moments, means interpreting religious and ethical sources in ways not only to blunt their religious violence, the topic of the lecture this morning, but also as a way to live out our responsibility for future generations on our exceedingly fragile planet, which is the focus of this lecture. So let's turn next to life and its values. I hope you don't mind. As I said this morning, when you have a University of Chicago professor in a room, there's a lot of hot air. Is everyone with me so far? Yeah. Trying to set the stage here. We need to note something about various religions beyond what I said this morning. And that is, many of the world's religions seek to redeem human beings from the earthly condition of life, or to enlighten human beings about the true nature of reality. If you recall that I said in the last lecture that religion is about what is ultimately real, ultimately important, and ultimately empowering, then it's not surprising that Buddhism, Christianity, in Hinduism, Islam, and strands of Judaism seem to hold that this world and this life is not all ultimately important, or real, or empowering. A Buddhist escapes the realm of samsara, the realm of suffering, through enlightenment, and therefore escapes the realms of rebirth, suffering and rebirth. Traditional Christians hoped in the final vision of God, or the coming of Christ. Muslims likewise have some conception of heaven, and on and on. The point is that as traditionally understood, the religions seem, I want to keep underlining, seem to devalue finite historical existence. And that has spawned the criticism of these religions. In other words, this is just another way to understand the old entanglement between religion and what I called practical atheists this morning. Many contemporary thinkers, Martha Nussbaum in Chicago, Tsvetan Todorov, the so-called new atheists, thinks that the religions promise an otherworldly goal for human life that devalues our actual lives. If the religions teach justice and love for others, so the critics argue, it's really just about you getting yourself into heaven or being enlightened. So if one does seek justice and the well-being in the here and now, as these critics of religion are arguing, one must, in principle, deny the religions, deny God or the gods. However, it's really interesting to note that philosophers in the ancient world, so I'm now turning the table back on the philosophers. Philosophers in the ancient world, like Plato, some of the Stoics, the Epicureans, up to our own time, and a thinker like Martin Heidegger, thought that, as Plato puts it, philosophy is learning to die. Or as Heidegger would put it, philosophy is gaining authenticity of existence in the face of death, self-sufficiency, self-mastery. The practice of philosophy was to confront death. Now, if that's encoded in Western civilization's conception of philosophy, then those who are criticizing the religions for not enhancing life need to turn it back on their own intellectual traditions, as part of what I'm saying. So I'm engaged in both a revision of religious and philosophical thinking. Now, while that is the case, again, I'm picking up on the point by Athlon that there are different strands in the religions. While that is the case, it is not the whole story. There is, in the biblical text, for instance, I'll continue with this, although you can find it in other traditions, a counter line of thought over and against this devaluing of finite life for the sake of heavenly life, or the focus on learning how to die. It is remarkable, as the New Testament scholar Gert Tyson has noted, that the early church was focused on new life in the spirit, or as St. Paul put it, freedom from the law of sin and death. There's a virtual new creation story in John 20:22, where Christ breathes on the disciples and says to them, receive the Holy Spirit. God is a living God who seeks life, not the death of the sinner. Christ came, as the Gospels put it, so that one might have life and have it abundantly. Much later, St. Irenaeus famously said, the glory of God is man fully alive. Whatever else one wants to say about Christian faith or any other tradition, about Christian love, the church, faith, hope, it is clear that the theme of life and new life is properly basic. Think too of Torah teaching. We read in Deuteronomy 30:19-20a, as Moses is giving his final speech to Israel before they crossed into the Jordan in God's presence, quote, I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curses. Choose life, so that you and your descendants may live, loving the Lord your God and holding fast to him. My point here is that there are resources within the religions to make the integrity of life basic to the religious life itself. Responsibility for the integrity of life, lived within diverse traditions, is the religion that we ought to inhabit, as the title of my lecture puts it. If that is the case, that is, if in order to take responsibility for the future, to live a religious life that enables rather than destroys a livable future, the question then becomes this one. What is the integrity of life for which we're responsible? What is the idea of meaning? And here a crucial point must be made at the outset, at least for me, before we get into this idea of the integrity of life. It is not, at least from my perspective or the traditions we've looked at, it is not life qua life that is the highest ethical good. There are situations when life must be justly, if tragically, ended, or heroically sacrificed. This is why, from my perspective, ideas about the reverence of life or the sanctity of life are finally wrong-headed. And it's why I've chosen to speak about the integrity of life as the good and the attitudes that we ought to adopt to that good is that we are to respect and enhance the integrity of life. So now I can explain this idea and how is it related to an account of human motivations and actions. So first, the integration of goods and needs. Is everyone with me? I've tried to show that there's been a shift because of the fragility of the future and because of social conflicts within society that we have to make some claim about the goodness of life as a central value we want to forward, even if we know that there are situations in which life competes with life and sometimes must be tragically sacrificed. In order to allow one to think that through, I'm speaking about the integrity of life, and now we're going to take this concept and break it into two parts. Everyone with me? This is a little heavy lifting here in terms of the conceptual analysis. But we're going to see that the integrity, the notion of integrity itself has two different levels that are important to think through these issues. So first, integrity designates the project of any living being that arises out of natural vitalities and desires and needs, namely, to integrate or to draw together a range of goods sufficient to fulfill basic needs and express capacities necessary for that form of life to continue, to exist, to resist disintegration, to resist non-being. The analogical use of the term life across diverse types of living beings is rooted in this dynamic of integration. And therefore, different life forms will integrate their lives in different ways. A human being, for instance, has needs and capacities for reflection and meaning that are simply missing at other organic levels of life. Even as human beings, no less than cells or animals, have to metabolize energy through interaction and communication with our environments. So the integration of life takes different forms depending upon what level of life one is looking at. Even the concept death is predicated analogically of beings owing to the diverse ways they integrate their existence. And this is why the religions have long known that human beings can die in many different ways. We have physical death. We have social death through the disintegration of communities. See what's going on with the outbreak of Ebola and the devastation it's working on communities or our armed conflicts. There's existential death in terms of the loss of meaning and purpose in life. And there's also even spiritual death, or the denial of the spiritual integrity of one's existence in the divine or the sacred. The religions also know that one can be physically alive and spiritually dead, existentially alive and physically dying. And that's possible because we integrate our lives in different ways. So theologically construed, this power of integration, this vitality of life itself, is, religiously seen, theologically seen, the divine spirit, the power of life itself. As St. Augustine put it in his Confessions, he utters at one point, God is the life of my life. This divine power is experienced at diverse levels of life, from the physical to the existential to the spiritual, in relationship to other life forms. Other religious traditions will speak about this power and how to get access at it in different ways. Okay? This is why I said this morning that access to the empowerment to live is important to the religions. And now I'm trying to show how that's embedded in the very notion of life being threatened by these different levels of death. The mark of finite life, in contrast to divine or eternal life, is that the capacity for integration is never complete. And in time, it is either destroyed or dissipated to the point of disintegration and thus death in its many forms. Sad to say, there is etched into our finite existence a remembrance of death that was with us our whole lifetime, even if the task here is learning how to live, not how to die. Further, any type of life advances or thwarts the integration of life in itself and others. There is real conflict in the world. There is also real concord in reality. And what we mean by good and evil on this first level of integrity are those actions and relations that either advance or thwart the integration of life among living beings. We can isolate then a range of goods entailed in this first level of thinking about the integrity of life. Let me note several. We'll see why this is important later. First, there are what we can call basic goods. Those are goods that adhere in finite life independent of human choice. How many in this room chose to be born or chose to have a body? Those are goods that we didn't choose. We choose what to do with them, but we didn't choose them themselves. Our bodies, taste for beauty, fear for death, the force of enjoyment and delight, the need for food and shelter, testify that finite life is not only vulnerable, but it's also valuable. This sense of basic goodness places constraints on human choices. Human choices should respect and enhance these basic goods when possible. Societies must interpret, rank, and respond to these goods in various ways. Basic goods are humanly experienced, most simply in terms of pleasure and pain as motivations for actions. We are drawn to what gives us pleasure. We recoil from what gives us pain. From this angle of vision, the labor of life, then, in good measure, is to stave off forces of disintegration, to forestall physical death in the constant affirmation of life within the struggle of life. So to be alive is to be constantly affirming one's own basic goods, even in the midst of the conflicts that besiege us. And this fact of finite life, provided at the very level of feelings of pleasure and pain, shows us that certain universal claims are incumbent upon us, that we ought not to inflict unjustified pain on others or ourselves. That seems to be a kind of baseline universal. Now, beyond basic goods, there's next a distinct realm of social goods. These goods depend on human action and choice, and yet action and choice in concert with others. Human existence and the life of most other creatures is profoundly social. Human existence always and everywhere entails standards, customs, rights, practices, and beliefs which communities develop in order to understand and guide their lives. These are social inventions, the work of social imagination and labor, which guide interactions within social and natural environments. Everyone in this room is interested in working with colleges and universities is interested in a social good and how one has to help that perdure through time. These include such things as families, economic and political institutions, friendships, patterns of interaction with other species, even the means to think, speak, and act together. And of course, they include religious communities as well. These are social goods that denote the relation to and yet distinction from other goods. They are forms of human excellence and well-being associated with fidelity to the well-being of others, the common good. Insofar as these social goods must be protected, used, enjoyed, and distributed, then social norms are obviously important. There is also a vulnerability found in social goods, namely the vulnerability to distortion, to injustice, to social oppression. These vulnerabilities and also the vitality of social existence impinge on another level of our existence. As social beings, we are motivated not just by pleasure and pain, but rather recognition and vulnerability to shame. Recognition and shame are motivations that situate human beings within social realities. The bonds of community come to arise in a sense of benevolence for others. But these same senses are open to distortion. The same sensibilities of the desire for recognition and the problem of shame. They're open to distortion when, for instance, racist polity breeds the shame of one's very being into one's life, say in sexism as a hatred of gender. Benevolence, too, can be stunted or destroyed. So attention to social goods requires the attunement to the dynamics of recognition and shame, as well as benevolence in human life, and the ways these can be distorted and therefore thwart our social lives. Awareness of the vulnerability and also the vitality of social goods exposes patterns of giving and receiving of respect. Threats to the social good arise when respect is wrongly withdrawn. I mean, I come from Chicago, we've got lots of gangs. And one thing that will always lead to death is if someone's disrespected. And I'm trying to suggest there's an insight into that, into the profundity of the way we are social beings, vulnerable to recognition and also to shame. There's a certain oughtness, an obligation to respect and enhance the integrity of social goods, as much as there is a sensibility to universality. You can call this the sense of finality. Now, third, people must take some reflective stance to basic and social goods and the motivations that arise from finite social life. Reflective goods, this is the third level, satisfy not only the drive for meaning in human life, but are also the possibility of creating new forms and ways of life. Reflective goods enable human agents to knowingly respond for themselves and others. These goods denote both a posture of interpretation and assessment towards basic and social goods, but they have value in themselves. This level of goods, reflective goods, are about truthful life, meaningfulness, and self-understanding. They are, in other words, the goods of cultures and civilizations and religions. That is the entire domain of human symbolic, linguistic, and practical meaning systems. Part of human distinctiveness is that we are self-interpreting animals, as Charles Taylor once put it, who constitute the coherence of our lives through judgments about what to do and to be in relation to others, and the variety of basic and social goods I've already noted. This gives a rise to a sense of autonomy, that is, a sense of self in relation to others, and also a sense of the gravity, the importance of one's own life. So in addition to the notion of universality that we've uncovered at the level of the basic feelings of pleasure and pain, and in addition to the sense of finality that we ought never to withdraw respect from another human being, we can also note an inarticulate sense and obligation for autonomy. We live our own lives with others, of course. And this sense bears within it a claim that one ought not to destroy or to mean one's own sense of agency or the agency of another human being. The idea of autonomy, in other words, is infused with a sense of justice. Now, human life, fourth level, you might be wondering why we're doing all this excavation. Well, I hope you'll see that by the end. That will be around 11:30 tonight. Plan on wrapping up this up. But bear with me. What I'm trying to show is that we live in a morally dense, deep, complicated world. We are not thrown into existence where there's no values in reality and have to make our way by the grit of our teeth. In fact, human life is saturated with values. And part of the trick is to understand how to rightly integrate those. So we have to unpack the complexity of values that inhere in our very being in the world as finite, social, reflective, and I'm going to say in a moment, local beings, in order to see the values that we have to take account of in making decisions about the future and how to be responsible. Okay? So let's turn to fourth. I'm going to call these local goods. Why? Well, human life always takes place somewhere. In some community, on some bit of earth, and during some time in history. We are creatures who exist in many interlocking contexts. Basic, social, and reflective goods are thereby located in space and time. The present time is one in which the earth and its many forms of life are endangered by climate change, species extinction. I read just parenthetically, 50% of the population of the Earth's animals have now ceased to live. 50%. Right? The reduction in biodiversity is staggering, and that's part of our locality. We have to take that seriously. Human life is intertwined then with goods of locality. Not only pleasure and pain, recognition and shame, or reflectively guilt and innocence. Those are different levels of feeling through the levels of goods. Not only those situate us in the world and our motives for actions at the levels of feelings and moods about the goods that saturate our life, the locality of natural goods arises with the feeling of participation or alienation amid various social, natural, and historical spaces. I mean, think of what happened in Hurricane Katrina. The dislocation of people from a place was extremely destructive. Or what is going on again in Syria or Iraq. Human beings are rooted creatures in some respect, and those places become very important for how we integrate our existence. So a norm for action then must not only be marked, as we've already excavated, by universality, by autonomy, but also by locality, and then also finality. Now notice, what we've done here is isolate a range of types of goods, marked not only by universality, finality, autonomy, but also locality. And I've also tried to show that each of these levels of goods are linked to sensibilities that we have, like pleasure and pain, recognition and shame, alienation and participation. We experience these kinds of values, I'm trying to suggest, at these deep levels of our feelings and attunements to different interactions. But then the winner of the Chicago Marathon this last weekend, right? Both the monk and the runner are integrating their life with respect to the range of all these goods, but in different ways. And this means, importantly, that human beings possess a distinctive form of freedom. That is, the freedom to integrate our lives and meet our needs in different ways. We are part of the community of life through the types of goods and needs we've just noted, as well as the motivations they entail. But human beings also have a distinctive form of freedom that exceeds our embeddedness in other forms of life. How then shall we live? What norms and values can guide the use of our freedom to bring integrity into our lives? This brings us to the second meaning of integrity. We move now from natural goods to the moral good itself. So next, the moral good. Folks with me so far? Trying to show how we're embedded in an extremely complex, value-saturated world. And we always have the problem of how we're going to integrate those goods, meet them if we're going to have our lives continue rather than disintegrate and die. We're always doing that in concert with, but also in competition with other forms of life. And so morally, we need to develop some kind of norm to help us think about living that task out responsibly. So now we're turning to the moral good. Rather than continue to explore the range of goods that must be met, the capacities exercised, and the goods attained for life to be integrated, we must turn to the second meaning of integrity, especially important for reflection on human responsibilities and the attitudes we can and ought to have towards realms of life. We do this because, as just noted, human beings are endowed with the freedom to integrate their lives in different ways. Integrity in this second related sense denotes moral or spiritual goodness. It is a goodness that arises within the life of someone who dedicates in action their own lives to respect and enhance the integrity and the integration of life in others, as well as in oneself. This meaning of integrity specifies the moral good, a kind of spiritual goodness that is only attainable, no matter how momentary or fragmentary, through responsible action. In other words, responsible action incarnates and realizes this form of goodness. A life of moral integrity is one that is integrated not simply in terms of the range of goods that meet needs and capacities, the social, basic, local, reflective goods we went through, but more radically through a committed project of respecting and enhancing those goods in, with, and for others, as well as oneself. A person or a community of integrity in this ethical sense is someone whose strength of conviction is manifest in a specific orientation in their actions and their relations. The integrity of life in this second sense denotes the moral vocation of human beings and communities. It is a unique good of the spiritual core and dynamic of human life. It is the moral good of responsible religious communities. What is more, moral integrity arises not with the brute awareness of the power to integrate life, or even with our needs and our capacities. It is rather an attribute for the exercise of action in and with and for others, wherein the power to act is deployed to respect and enhance rather than to demean and destroy the integrity of others' lives. It is a kind of, oddly enough, free self-limitation. So one's not only pursuing the integrity of one's own existence, integrating all those goods, one is pursuing the well-being, the integration of goods in others, and therefore a kind of interesting self-limitation arising out of respect and care for others. But this self-limitation, the religions suggest, is actually empowered by some superhuman power, by the divine or the sacred. The amoral person or community abides by the demands of responsibility only to meet their own needs and goods. The moral person is acting on the principle to respect and enhance the integrity of life with and for others, simply because that is the claim of conscience on themselves. Now, obviously, this moral vision does not warrant self-negation or abasement. Moral integrity is not another name for servitude or ascetic self-mutilation, but is rather the proper free self-relation in the realm of responsible actions and relations. The good of moral integrity entails the commitment to respect and enhance the integrity of life in with and for others as well as oneself, as I've noted. Now, I'm suggesting that human beings exist at the intersection of these two senses of integrity that I've been going through. The integration of basic goods and needs rooted in the vitalities of life, experienced in different sensibilities that we have to integrate in order to go on living. And we do so amid forces of disintegration and death. But human beings also live with the second sense of integrity, what I call the call of conscience to moral integrity. The plight of our lives from this perspective is the failure to apprehend this complexity of being human and the will to rightly live therein, the will to live with moral integrity. More profoundly, it's a failure to see and understand that in various ways our lives are open through the freedom to integrate our lives to what the religions call God or nirvana or some superhuman power. The religions are meant to give us access to that kind of power in order to live a life of moral integrity. And that conclusion brings us to the last step in this lecture, because we can now ask, which religion and what future? Now, earlier today and this evening, we have undertaken a long, very long, but I hope not too arduous or boring, a journey of ethical and religious reflection. Our task was to answer the question, does religion have a future? In order to get at that question and to formulate some answer to it, required undertaking two interrelated but distinct levels of reflection. We needed first to isolate the ways the question of religion's future is being formulated in our post-secular global times. And that led us into different forms of religion, missionary and non-missionary, and the vulnerability each has to fanaticism and violence, the work of this morning's lecture. And we also noted this morning the dangerous interaction of practical atheism and fanatical religion. And I suggested that the vulnerabilities to violence in the religions are realized and take violent expression when identity is made the condition of responsibility. That is, when who we are wars against others or seeks to remake them in our own image. In order to think through the meaning of responsibility and how it might shape religious identity, we had to think through what it means to make the integrity of life of the good for which we are responsible. And that led in this lecture to analysis of different levels of goods as well as the moral good. But surprisingly, while thinking about those goods and their integration, we uncovered a distinctive human capacity of freedom. When this freedom is exercised responsibly, that is, when a person or community orients and forms their freedom so that in their actions and relations they respect and enhance the integrity of life with and for others, then identity is being shaped by responsibility. And that insight is why I spoke in the first lecture about freedom within religion, not freedom from religion, which we want to insist on too, right? Or freedom of religion, you can practice it whatever way you want, but freedom within religion to reinterpret our religions in their most responsible ways. We are free to interpret our religions in ways that are responsible, ways that respect and enhance the integrity of life. And the religious challenge of our age is to interpret and live out that freedom whose form is responsibility. It is for the sake of future to choose life rather than death. And the responsible free religion I have been suggesting is a possibility within every one of the world's religions. The real challenge is for us now to live it out. Thank you very much. Thank you all very much. That was a dense argument, I know, or a dense professor, one of the two. So let's open it up to questions. We have a fair amount of time, is that correct? That's the idea here. Yeah.
I'm going to come around with the mic. If you would hold your question till I can get to you so everyone can hear the question fully, I'd appreciate it. Dr. Schweiker is going to indicate what question he's going to take, and I'll run there as fast as I can.
Okay, does this on? Yeah, this morning I was moving off mic, so they gave me, come on down. So any questions, comments, confusions, criticisms? Right up here, yes.
Well, not my own.
Yeah.
Well, not so much a criticism or a comment, but a question. So how then do we as members of faith communities encourage our larger communities to undertake such a project?
Well, that's a strategic question for those in religious leadership to figure out. And I assume that's part of what these meetings are about. That is, we all are the privileged people to be able to think through these kinds of questions within the communities we find ourselves. I don't think there's any set pattern of doing that, partly because the communities we're in have different religious resources, different practices, different institutional forms, right? I'm a United Methodist, and I suppose every one of my bishops would like to say I have to do certain things, but it's not going to work that way, right? So one of the tasks for us as religious leaders and religious people is precisely to figure out how we can enable ourselves and others most freely to inhabit those religious identities responsibly, given the historic shape of those communities. So the religion I'm professing here isn't some kind of super religion. It's rather a way of being religious within the historic religions. That's what I'm trying to get at. Did I dodge that question sufficiently?
I'm not sure that in terms of one community may see that the natural way, the moral way is one way. Another community may see it in a different way, and a third community would see it as a third way.
Right.
How do you reconcile or have the different communities? Sometimes differences may not be that wide, other times could be cataclysmic. How do you bring that together?
That's part of the reason to isolate these levels of goods. because one can sit down with others who you disagree with and try to think through how one ranks, understands, and interprets these different levels of goods. Basic goods, reflected goods, social goods, local goods. That gives a grid with which to start thinking about commonalities and differences. And that can provide some space for discussion of where things can go or can't go. The second step is to realize that we have to take a moral stance to all of those goods, whether they're to be respected and enhanced, or whether they're to be demeaned and destroyed. And I think one can move to that second level, and then we'll be into the debate about how one ranks those goods and so forth. So again, I think one of the jobs of ethics is to provide frameworks for thinking through the infinitely complex problems that people face in their context, rather than trying to answer every problem, right? So I've tried to provide a framework within which we can see that we share a lot with other human beings. You know, it's not shocking that mothers weep over their dying children. It's not shocking that people love their families. So we do share a lot of goods. Where things get different is how we rank them, how we integrate them, and what norm under which we integrate them. And those are the points where you can then have a framework for discussion with people that disagree with each other. Now, if you say, well, what do you do to the fascist who comes to my door and knocks on it and asks, am I protecting anybody? At that point, folks, from my vantage point, ethics has ended. You can't argue with such tyrannous force. That's why I said life itself is not an ultimate good. I think there are ways in which one has to resist those kinds of tyrannies. But unless you're dealing with the fanatic, I think there are ways to use this kind of model to think through problems. The philosopher Alfred North Whitehead once said, can you all hear me? Am I coming through? Once said that civilization is the triumph of persuasion over force. Fabulous, right? I'm trying to provide a way in which people can morally persuade others and themselves, rather than through the resort to force. Very good question. Yes?
Wondering if perhaps you could take us through like a tricky ethical situation with your theory of self-limitation. Just thinking of like other ethical theories and systems, like utilitarianism is going to give us the most good is what we should follow. The veil of ignorance from John Rawls is going to give us people behind this veil decide what is just. So I was just wondering, like, what would this theory of self-limitation look like played out in a tricky ethical situation?
Yeah, that's very good. And it's actually related to part of, there's much more of this theory that I couldn't get into this evening. You may have noticed that I constantly said we're to respect and enhance the integrity of life. Now, those two terms, respect and enhance, are extraordinarily important, and the order of them is extraordinarily important, at least for me. What do I mean? If one takes as your basic moral norm that you are to enhance your life and that of others, that means, and utilitarianism does this actually, that means that you're going to exert whatever power you have to make someone else's life better in whatever way you think it should be made better. One sees this in hospital situations a lot, where folks who are on feeding tubes and so on are kept alive month after month after month under the notion that we have to enhance that life, right? Respect, and we do need to enhance life. I'm not negating that. I just don't think it's the first demand. The first demand is respect. What is respect? Respect is the acknowledgement of the worth and dignity of someone else, irrespective of myself. An act of respect is an interesting form of self-limitation. I'm saying I do not have the right to remake your life so that it's enhanced the way I think it should be. So I think we have to begin with the respect of others, and only then move on to enhancement. Okay? And we're respecting the integrity of their lives, how they've drawn their lives together. I can't say that I'm respecting the fabulous female runner who won the Chicago Marathon this last weekend by changing her life that doesn't have to do with running, right? So I think respect has to be a minimum baseline. Now, interestingly enough, we've got a lot of how many Calvinists are there in the room?
What do you mean by
We got a few. You've read John Calvin.
You know,
It's interesting, in his commentary on the Ten Commandments in the third book of the Institutes, he has a negative statement and then always a positive. So, you shall not kill, respect. You should do everything to help your neighbor's life flourish, enhance. So I think that interrelation of those two notions is both deeply embedded in religious traditions. And that's why Hillel says, do not do to others what you would not want done to you. That's basically the principle of respect and reciprocity. Now, if you're asking, is this everyone following so far? This is part of what I couldn't get into in the lecture, and am I getting to your concerns? Yeah. How I then go about trying to show the truthfulness would take us into another discussion. But that's very important to grasp, for me at any rate. We live in a culture that wants to enhance everything. How many people in here have went out and bought the iPhone 4? No, the iPhone 6 is what, right? We, as a culture, we are constantly wanting to enhance things, to the point where we even go in and try to change regimes in other nations. And I'm saying there always has to be some brakes on the desire to enhance things.
Like your voice.
Huh?
Enhancing your voice.
Enhancing my voice, sorry. Yes, sir, you were next. Back in the back, there we go.
Could you cite a couple of examples where you think that the principles you're talking about have been successfully applied to resolve some serious situations?
Well, this is one of the curious things about ethics. Because if we always fulfilled the moral demands, we wouldn't need them. So there's a way in which moral norms are never completely realized because they are setting aspirations towards which we're struggling. That being said, as a Christian, I must say that moral integrity was enacted at least by one human being. And that's why he's called the Christ. And therefore the Christian life becomes access to that person. But in a more simple sense, I think that daily, people around the world are trying to respect others' lives and then enhance them. Maybe not completely, maybe they can't do it sinlessly as a Christ would do, or as a Buddha would do, a Buddhist would say. But the paradox here is that moral norms are always counterfactual. They're always putting pressure on us to change what we're doing, right?
Because I'm wondering particularly about any highly visible or public situations where following your suggestions has been lived out successfully.
Well, one example, in a book called Lest Innocent Blood Be Shed, there was a village of Swiss Calvinists after World War II, La Chambon, that housed and hid Jews throughout World War II. And they constantly said that they did this simply because that's what they're commanded to do. And I think that would be one example of this kind of thing. I think the incredible self-restraint among the young protesters in Hong Kong when they're being gassed is an inkling of what it might mean to respect and enhance life, their own and others, right? But that's always going to be somewhat fragmentary because we as human beings can't fulfill this absolutely. Yes?
I'll just stand up. I'm a preacher. I've got a loud mouth.
At the risk of talking about politics a little bit, could President Obama's statement saying that he's not going to bring a military solution to ISIS be part of that moral fulfillment, or heading toward that moral ground?
Well, if you mean, that's a complicated question, because the president has the primary responsibility to defend the Constitution, and therefore this union. And because of his office, he has what we call a prima facie obligation to respect and further and enhance the purposes of the United States. So on one level, he just has constitutional requirements to do such. And it would be irresponsible of him not to respect and enhance the very community that's elected him to defend the Constitution. Right? On the other hand, if you mean that we should not intervene in the lives of other peoples, but as much as possible to allow self-determination, the difficulty there is that ISIS is a fairly vicious crowd of folks who are rejected by most Muslims themselves. So that's where the argument also gets difficult. Can you clarify? Maybe I'm just not getting it. Wouldn't be the first time.
Yeah, I didn't mean that we shouldn't intervene, but that we shouldn't, well, to use Paul, repay evil for evil. So, you know, that kind of moral restraint, and forgive me for being who I am. I'm an American, I can't help that. I like that most of the time. But I believe that, you know, much like the Sabbath, which was made to enhance life or to serve life, the Constitution, we aren't made to serve the damn Constitution. It was made to serve us.
Right.
And if in our pursuit of the Constitution, it gets in the way of how we're perceived and how others see the primary power in the world acting, well, maybe the president needs to do something different than that and break the law.
I mean, if you were saying that Obama's foreign policy, at least as I understand it, has interjected a fair amount of restraint in our foreign policy, I would agree, and I think it's been a good thing, a very good thing on that score. This question of tit for tat, Gandhi once said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, merely means everyone ends up blind and toothless. So it's a very interesting problem to think through how you end cycles of recrimination. That's right. Here, and then over here.
If you could help me, what I wrestle with when you talk about the call of conscience, or conscience integrity, or living a meaningful life, however you say it, and how, at what point, with self-limitation, respecting and enhancing, where does one draw that fine line when you know that there are people who are homeless or don't have potable water, and how do we, regardless of the religion that we have our moral identity within, I would think that is a universal issue of not basic goods, social goods. I would think that would be a common thread that would bring that integrity within our individual religions to action. But at what point how do you choose the level of self-limitation, I guess, is my
Very,
question.
very good question. And let's go at this in a number of ways, real quickly. Another part of this lecture I had to leave out is a whole theory of conscience. All I mean by that term, to put it most simply, is the experience of the claim of the integrity of life in others and in oneself on oneself. It's to become morally aware that we are in the world in such a way that we need to figure out what we owe others, what we owe ourselves. So the first thing is just the realization that we live in a moral world. And that's the call of conscience. Okay? This has also reference in various religious traditions. It's one level of enlightenment. In my own tradition in Methodism, John Wesley said there was always two forms of faith. First is the awakening to the realization that one is in a religious and moral world, and the second is to move on to full faith. So many of the religions have ways, they're suggesting, and I think if we're honest about it, it's very true, a lot of human beings, and ourselves included, are going through life asleep. We have to be awoken to the reality that we live in a deep moral world that is saturated with goodness. And the call of conscience is that awakening. Okay? A lot of argument that would have to go on to substantiate that that's what that is. The question then is, how does that bear on our understanding of limiting our power out of respect for others, right? Where do you draw the line? Well, that is where, unfortunately, that becomes a case-by-case problem. It would depend on what the context is, what communities are involved, how those communities have integrated their own lives, what is the differential of power between the one community and another. With more power comes more responsibility. That's a trite phrase, but it's profoundly true. And therefore, where power is going to be limited, it will be different depending upon the community or the individual involved. Does that help?
Well,
Are we?
take one more, he's had his hand up.
Okay, John.
Dialogue between two folks. One, concern about what's happening in our world and feels morally obligated to be involved in some kind of way. Other person looks at the most serious tragedies that we have going, the slaughtering and taking off of people's heads and other issues. And inwardly somewhat rejoices because it feels like to them the end of the world will come soon and God will take over and it's about time. These are dialogues that even affect our political life right now, depending on where people come from. I struggle with how do you even get the conversation you have shared with us tonight in a world that's often between those kinds of dialogues.
Well, this is part of the reason why I went through the criticism of religion as denying the worth of finite life. That's part of the reason why I wanted to mention that. Secondly, I think the job of ethics is to protect the finite. It's trying to treasure the vulnerabilities and fragilities of actual human and social life. If someone cannot see that, I mean, this may sound like an odd response I'm going to give. After going through this whole argument about levels of goods, there is a way in which I'd have to say to that person, just look again. Just think through again. At the level of your own feelings, have you ever had pleasure or pain? Have you ever felt ashamed or desire recognition? Have you ever found yourself alienated when you wanted to participate in some reality? In fact, that whole religious mindset is built on alienation, actually. alienation from the cultural worlds there, in my judgment. So I would have to say, look and feel again, and see if you cannot see that your own life is making these claims upon you. If that is not sufficient, then the theological tradition, at least in Christianity, has a great term for this. It's called invincible ignorance. And what just realizes the person is, right? We have to admit that some folks will not be persuaded. But if one wants to avoid the slide from persuasion to force, then all I can do is say, look, feel again.
It's been a long day. Well, for many of us, it's been a long day, especially for our speaker, but I think it's been extremely stimulating and very helpful in helping us think these issues through. Before we leave, though, I once again want to thank Sylvia Kaufman, the founder of the consortium and the leader of these activities, and the Kaufman family for what they've done to create the Kaufman Interfaith Institute. So as we leave,
publicly for your articles in the newsletter that we've been getting in the emails. They have been fabulous this year. Thank you for those.
and in response, I invite you to have dessert.